Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Grajdek. I'm Dr. Martha Grajdek. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Psychological contracts at work are a big deal, a bigger deal than many realize, and just as big a deal as those official written contracts. When psychological contracts go awry or are not honored in any way, things can go sideways quickly. Let's start by defining psychological contracts at work. These are unwritten expectations on both sides, that of the employee and the employer. They can be defined as informal, unwritten understandings between employee and employer. Psychological contracts are shaped by expectations, mutual obligations, and perceptions. And unlike written contracts, which are considered to be legally binding, psychological contracts at work would not hold up in court in the same way. They are not legally binding. However, just as I said, they can be just as critical, just as impactful as contracts that are written and legally binding. How are psychological contracts formed? This starts at the point of hiring. When a person is brought into an organization, there are expectations, there are obligations, perceptions, and assumptions on both sides, the employer and the new employee. The organizational culture is a big contributor to psychological contracts. After all, it's the company's culture that shapes the environment and affects an individual's experience, workplace experience on a daily basis. And of course, leadership behavior is another big contributing factor to psychological contracts. This means not only leadership at the top of the company, but also those in middle management and other leadership or management positions. What are some examples of psychological contracts? Well, these can include behaviors that maybe are not written down as an expectation, but are part of that unwritten expectation, behaviors for employees and behaviors for employer, for management and leadership. A specific example could be something like being able to work on your own time or to work your own hours as long as you produce the work that is expected of you and do so while adhering to the necessary quality requirements and deadlines. An employer may not care too much about when or where you do the work, as long as the end results of what you turn in, what you produce, are what the employer is expecting. Another psychological contract may be something like a manager backing up his or her people. Sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes things go wrong. And a psychological contract, as an example, may be such that the manager, while he or she will do whatever they need to do to fix the situation, will always back up their people and not blame them or otherwise throw them under the bus. So these are just a couple of examples of what a psychological contract between employee and employer may look like. What happens when a psychological contract is breached? And of course, this could be by either side, either by the employee or the employer. First and foremost, there's a certain amount of loss of trust. Maybe it's a partial loss of trust, or maybe trust is lost in its entirety. This may lead to changes in behavior. It can lead to changes in motivation or engagement, higher turnover. On management's part, it could mean changes in behavior that may result in things such as micromanagement or keeping a closer eye on someone simply because the trust that was once there is now gone. It may mean loss of privileges or freedoms. When trust is lost, autonomy that was once a given may no longer be an option. So while these psychological contracts are unofficial and unwritten, they come with tremendous responsibility for everyone involved. Because once there is a breach of such a contract, that employee-employer relationship may become damaged, sometimes to the point where it cannot be repaired. What are some of the things that are critical for maintaining psychological contracts? Transparency tends to be at the top of the list. This is where free exchange of information, along with things such as trust and honesty, come into play. Open and frequent communications are also key. Sometimes it is by making assumptions that people end up breaching psychological contracts. This is where communication can be critical. It's better to ask or clarify than to assume and make a mistake, especially when it comes to psychological contracts. An important part to mention here when it comes to that ongoing open communications, expectations and expectation management is key here. This is another area where we don't want to leave things up for guessing or making assumptions. And again, this goes in both directions. An employer should be clear about their expectations, but an employee should be able to speak up freely and express their expectations as part of that psychological contract. Remember, in order for a psychological contract to be successful, there has to be an equal ground to some degree, in some sense, where it is fair to both parties. Something else to consider here while we talk about psychological contracts at work, what it comes down to really is the relationship between employee and employer. And psychological contracts are a part of that relationship. Another thing to consider is that the idea of a psychological contract at work is not only limited between employee and employer, they exist among coworkers as well. There are expectations, there are assumptions, there are behaviors that will be acceptable and expected according to psychological contracts between colleagues. Damaging such psychological contracts or breaching them can have detrimental effects just as easily as it does when a contract is breached between employee and employer. The same rules apply in terms of maintaining and taking care of a psychological contract, whether it's between employee and employer or two colleagues. Lastly, when it comes to contracts, especially ones that are not written down, trust can be tremendous. It's one thing when there's a contract that is written down, perhaps one that is legally binding, but when we are talking about things that are unwritten, that are agreed upon verbally more than anything else, trust becomes absolutely critical. There is no paper or a document to which we can refer during a dispute. Psychological contracts are only as good as the parties who enter them. So it's about trust, about being a person of your word, and about doing what you say you will do. In some sense, psychological contracts can have more weight than written contracts, not so much legally, but in terms of the human experience. Things can be put into documents, but they mean nothing if one or both of the parties don't hold up to that agreement. Writing it down doesn't mean anything. But when there's an agreement that is unwritten, a contract, like the psychological contract, that is informal, and people manage to hold up their part of the deal, that makes that contract so much more valuable and so much more meaningful. And of course, as a result, breach of such a contract can be absolutely devastating. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Psychological contracts at work are very important for both the health and well-being of the company itself, but also of every individual employee. Psychological contracts are informal and unwritten understandings between employee and employer, but they can also exist between colleagues. Oftentimes, they are established during the time of hiring and are influenced by company culture and leadership. Honesty and open communication are critical when it comes to psychological contracts and their health and validity. Breaching such contracts can have devastating effects, sometimes causing people to leave an organization. Creating and maintaining psychological contracts is everyone's responsibility. Beyond trust and open communications, expectations and their management play an important role in psychological contracts. As the week unfolds, I encourage you to consider psychological contracts. Think about what kind of psychological contracts exist between you and your employer, or if you are the employer, you and your employees. And of course, psychological contracts do exist between colleagues. That's another one to consider as well. How well are you living up to your end of that contract? Are expectations clear? How is the trust? What about communication? And as always, I encourage you to think about whether there's room for improvement. There often is. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of this podcast, along with other videos which focus on stress management. As I said, Stress Free with Dr. G can be found on YouTube. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.